When I was a kid in the 90s, we had a term for a specific group of kids. They always had a key around their neck, and the term was Latchkey Kids. It described kids that were aggressive, picked fights a lot, didn't do well in school, bullies. And the funny thing also is that in my memory, those kids always had a PlayStation. Whereas the good kids, like me, the more nerdy kids, the more gentle kids, always had a Nintendo 64. Both parents were working, and so when school ended, they had to let themselves into the house and wait there until their parents came back from work. The other parents, or the other mothers, considered those kids neglected. Back then it was still frowned upon that both parents worked. Specifically, I guess, that the mother was working. So they were basically the opposite of a nuclear family. Soon we will all be nuclear families again, if you know what I mean. That's a bad joke. Anyway, I never thought about where that term came from. And it turns out that it originated during World War II. The men of the house had to go fight in the war, and mothers had to get a job. So when thinking about that, I asked myself, was that true? Was there a divide between a certain kind of kids that had the N64 or a PlayStation? And was it true that these Latchkey kids had PlayStations more than Nintendo 64s? And what decides who wanted to have which console or which game? So many questions. Let's find out and take a tour through some 90s gaming history. Well, maybe we can find the answer in the type of games. Sony's PlayStation gained a library of titles that was noticeably edgier and more violent than what had been typical on Nintendo's consoles. By the late 90s, if you peek into a PlayStation's owner's game collection, you might find titles like Resident Evil, with flesh-eating zombies, and Mortal Kombat with spine-ripping and horrible finishing moves, or GTA. With carjacking and crime, especially, in that the first version, I think the very first GTA had a top-down view. And I remember you would just go on those killing sprees, and eventually, it escalated with the police chasing you, and there would be a tank in one of the backyards. And once you got that, that's when the fun began. I remember back then thinking, yeah, that's where they keep the tanks, in the backyard. I mean, obviously they don't keep them on the street. So yeah, if there are tanks standing around, probably hidden in the backyard somewhere. But you also had like Twisted Metal, which were weaponized cars blowing each other up, and all kinds of stuff. And in 1995, for instance, Sony ran TV ads for the fighting game Battle Arena Toshiden, featuring a dominatrix-style character, Sophia, in leather and wielding a whip. And she would say things like, "Do you like to be humiliated by women? Here's your dream date. Worship me." And that was teenagers. No wonder they turned out the way they did. I think in the end it had like the tagline, "The more you kill, the better you feel." Something like that. Yeah, those were crazy times. I don't know. I don't think there would be an ad like this today. Times have gotten better and worse at the same time. Don't ask me how that is possible, but it is. And those games carried the mature age ratings, and plenty of digital gore was in them. And Nintendo, on the other hand, had, a plumber stomping goofy cartoon turtles and not really any bloodshed, which, when you think about it, like a guy just running over the beach, stomping on turtles, that's not very nice either. That's even kind of psychopathic, I think. But the point being is you had more games like Banjo-Kazooie, where a bear was carrying a semi-flightless bird around in his backpack, and you had to solve literal puzzles. You would go around the world and collect these golden puzzle pieces that were alive, like everything was alive in that game. And once you have had enough of these puzzle pieces, you could put together a puzzle and go through it, and then basically fight a green witch that had abducted Banjo's little sister. It was a weird concept. So maybe it's logical that the kids who crave darker and more violent fantasies in their games would flock to the PlayStation, and that might reflect something about their personality. And since they were home alone, unsupervised, with unlimited screen time, which, by the way, is the dream, those two things went hand in hand. They were violent and they were craving violent games. Because it was PlayStation that had the guns and death. But there's a problem with that logic. And the name of that problem is Bond. James Bond. Because Nintendo had GoldenEye. GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64 wasn't just a hit, it was a pop cultural phenomenon. Developed by a rookie team at Rare consisting of mostly first-time developers straight out of university, and by the way, the same company that made Banjo-Kazooie. That team was tasked with adapting the 1995 Bond film that introduced Pierce Brosnan and was, no discussion, the best Bond film ever. You can argue about Pierce Brosnan, being the best Bond ever. He was my Bond. You grow up with a certain Bond and you're just faithful to that Bond. A faithful Bond towards Bond. But that's just how it is, Back then there was another term that was used to describe men who took care of their appearance, and it was called metrosexual. And I think I remember some men being described that way. And I think Pierce Brosnan was the first metrosexual Bond, which was a huge deal back then, and now it's just like, we moved on from those terms. But the thing is, the game was delivered 2 years after the movie's release, so long past its marketing prime, and yet it became a phenomenon, revolutionizing console shooters with stealth mechanics, mission-based gameplay, and the legendary split-screen multiplayer. Like, it was split in 4, and you would just sit there with your friends, and it was amazing. Never before, never after had a James Bond film left such a big mark culturally on gaming. And to this day, GoldenEye remains one of the most iconic and unlikely success stories of this era. But again, that's the problem. That was on Nintendo, so clearly Nintendo was not 100% free of violence. Like, the N64's library, while smaller, did include T-rated and even M-rated games. Another popular N64 shooter, Perfect Dark, went even further with sci-fi firearms and earned a mature rating. And they also had a dinosaur shooter game. I can't remember what it was called, but you were like this Rambo character, and somehow you were transported back into the dinosaur age, but it was also the future. I don't know. And you had to shoot dinosaurs and fight with them. And that was scary, man. Dinosaurs are scary. Ever since I saw Jurassic Park for the very first time back in the day, I am scared of dinosaurs. To this day. Like, I'm glad they're extinct. And still, whenever I walk home at night, which I rarely ever do because I never leave home, I'm not afraid of people in the dark. I'm afraid that a raptor comes out of the bushworks and it just eats my head. Or whatever. That's a true fact. But so if a violent game library is what supposedly made PlayStation kids bad, we must admit that Nintendo kids also had access to virtual violence. You can just ask anyone who played GoldenEye, like myself. And I was a good kid. But a funny side note, back then, Nintendo's leadership was nervous about tarnishing their family-friendly image, and so Nintendo's own Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and Zelda, felt GoldenEye had too much close-up killing and suggested that developers tone it down. And in a now famous anecdote, Miyamoto even proposed that at the end of GoldenEye, the enemy characters should all come back and shake hands with the player in a hospital to show it was all just pretend. The developers compromised by adding a silly end credit scene introducing the characters as if they were actors, explicitly reminding players, these are not real people, this is not real killing. So coming back to our question, there still was something about Nintendo, right? So if we can't claim that, PlayStation was all the violent games and Nintendo exclusively was not, maybe it was about the console itself. Because those two consoles had a very interesting difference, which might shed some light on the psyche of those Latchkey Kids. Because maybe the real difference was not just the game violence, but the style of play and social setting that each console encouraged. Because consider this, Nintendo 64 famously had 4 controller ports right on the front of the console. It was practically inviting you to gather 3 friends on the couch for a round of Mario Kart or Mario Party or, GoldenEye on the 4-player split screen. And many Nintendo games, even the Violent ones emphasized local multiplayer, a social, often family-friendly activity in the living room. The PlayStation, by contrast, had only 2 controller ports. You could get a multi-tap access for 4, but very few games even used it. And a lot of PlayStation hits were single-player or head-to-head 2-player experiences, when you think about Final Fantasy or Tekken. And that might have led to a subtle cultural difference. Nintendo kids often played together with siblings or buddies in the same room, while PlayStation gaming could be a more solitary, one-on-one affair. You might speculate that Nintendo kids were softer because they were playing party games with supervision nearby, whereas PlayStation kids might have holed up in their bedroom alone fighting through bloody storylines. And there's some anecdotal support for this, because the quintessential N64 experience was something like GoldenEye deathmatches at a sleepover, or laughing at someone for falling off Rainbow Road in Mario Kart. I hated that level. And with PlayStation, the quintessential experience might have been immersing yourself solo in Final Fantasy VII, or 2 teen boys dunking it out in Tekken 3, while the rest of the family was elsewhere. But while I was thinking about those hypotheses, I discovered a huge flaw in my reasoning: the parents. Because back in the day, I don't know how it is today, you didn't have a credit card from your dad and just bought stuff online and the next day it was on your doorstep. You had to walk into a store and pay with money. Typically, a 10-year-old wouldn't just go into the city and walk up into a game store and say, hey, look at me, I'm a Latchkey Kid, give me the violent stuff. If anybody bought the games, the parents did. So maybe that's the key. Neglecting parents bought the violence. The idea being, since the stereotype was those parents were neglecting, they just bought violent games. Not because they said, oh, you're a violent kid, here, have the violent stuff. But because they didn't understand, what games were. When it comes to the 90s and gaming and parents, you have to understand one thing. Parents were confused. Because in the 1990s, parents were walking blindly through a rapidly evolving digital playground. And most of them had no idea what their kids were actually doing. Video games weren't just toys anymore. They were becoming complex, cinematic, and sometimes violent. Adults were terrified. The evening news warned about murder simulators like Doom. There were congressional hearings debating whether Mortal Kombat's pixelated blood could corrupt children's morals. And Oprah once aired a segment asking whether video games could rewire the brain. So for many parents raised on board games and Saturday morning cartoons, gaming was an alien world, filled with strange jargon, dark themes, and blinking screens that stole hours from their kids' lives. And it wasn't just video games either. This panic echoed the moral uproars of the previous decade, like the infamous Dungeons and Dragons scare of the 1980s, when a Texas teenage suicide was falsely blamed on the involvement with the pen and paper RPG. Evangelical figures like Pat Robertson and Jack Chick fanned hysteria with claims that D&D led kids into witchcraft and Satanism, a legacy of fear that bled into the way parents viewed any fantasy world, no matter whether it was with Dungeons and Dragons or dice or games or just screens. So by the 90s, this anxiety migrated to consoles. Games like Final Fantasy VII, with its apocalyptic storylines and giant summoned monsters, were met with confusion and concern. Was this educational? Was it safe? Why does this guy have a 6-foot sword? You can't really do anything with a 6-foot sword. Anyway, and when you add to that the rise of 3D graphics and CD-ROMs, which gave games a gritty realism, that really unnerved adults who still thought Nintendo meant Mario jumping on mushrooms. But it also meant that another big portion of parents often assumed all games were created equal, that Crash Bandicoot and Resident Evil lived in the same neighborhood, and that if a game came in a colorful box, it was probably harmless. Some tried to stay informed, but the ESRB rating system was new and easy to ignore. Others just gave in to their kids' pleading and hoped for the best. I remember my first game on the N64 was actually Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is just simply the best game ever made. And I remember my mom asking the guy who sold it, "Is that violent?" And he was like, "Nah." First time I got hugged by a Redead, yeah, that's another thing. Dinosaurs and Redead. It was a time of confusion, a dad would just buy Twisted Metal just because it had cool cars on the front. And the cultural script hadn't caught up yet, and so for a while, nobody really knew what their kids were playing, only that they were quiet behind that closed bedroom door. So maybe some parents actively researched or held conservative views on games and hence might opt for safe Nintendo and never let their kids near an M-rated game. And on the other hand, parents who were less attentive or knowledgeable might just have bought whatever their children begged for. That meant a PlayStation, and those titles end up in their home. So when you think about this old stereotype, the logic would be those parents who didn't care about their kids because, they made them Latchkey Kids because they were so selfish going to work and paying for the bills, didn't care what the children played, and that's how they ended up with those violent games, which then matched their violent nature. And Nintendo kids, coming from those nuclear families, being protected, and maybe more conservative homes, they ended up with Banjo-Kazooie and the weird bird in their backpack. But still, even if you follow that logic, parents wouldn't buy violent games unless their children asked for it. So that raises another Banjo-Kazooie puzzle piece, because what made a kid desire the PlayStation and those violent games in the first place? And because, as we said, it's unlikely that the parents push the violent games onto their kids, in a sense of, here, I won't be around while you're growing up, so take this violent game and prepare for the streets that you soon will live on. So where did this demand come from? Well, the answer, probably with every influence for younger kids, is other kids. But not just any other kid, specifically older kids. Because back then it seemed that mainly older kids played PlayStation. And if you know one thing about older kids, they are a huge influence, for better or worse. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the internet was a wild place. The stuff older kids showed you was even wilder. Like there was this website on the normal internet, not the darknet, but on the normal internet, which was called rotten.com. And the stuff you saw on that website was pictures of the aftermath of real-life accidents, war, murder. It was horrible. And I still remember first time seeing that, I had a sleepover at a friend's house and his older brother came into the room asking, hey guys, you want to see some weird shit? What kid says no to that? Of course we want to see that. And somehow children have like a protective layer so that they don't get traumatized too easily. I don't know. Because if I saw one of those things today, I'd go unconscious immediately. And I would not recover easily. I'd probably see that picture for weeks. So maybe older kids played PlayStation and a specific kind of kid got influenced by them. Because also back in the day, I remember there were two groups of kids. Those who admired older kids and found them cool and wanted to be like them, and those who were afraid of them. I was in the second group. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And again, I think there was that divide, right? So maybe the rougher kids wanted to mimic the edgy kids, and since they played PlayStation, that's what they ended up wanting to have too. But then you have to ask yourself, why did the older kids wanted a PlayStation? Where did that come from? Well, as so many answers, maybe for this question too, we'll find it in marketing. Because the marketing of Nintendo and PlayStation was definitely different. Nintendo had been in the video game business since the 1980s and had carefully cultivated a family-friendly image after learning hard lessons from the 90s violence panic. For instance, in the analogy of 1994's Parents' Guide, it said, if Nintendo were to handle a child falling down a well, they might alter all the wells so none was more than 2 feet deep. Sega would leave the wells as they found them, but post a conspicuous warning sign. So in other words, Nintendo's philosophy was to remove offensive content to protect kids, whereas Sega and later Sony would allow it, but slap a rating or warning on it. This remained mostly true. Nintendo's US branch enforced content guidelines throughout the early 90s. No graphic violence, no nudity, no drugs, limited gore. It started to change once the industry adopted ratings like the ESRB, but even then Nintendo's own marketing stayed comparatively tame. It was clearly a response to competitors. For example, during the 90s console wars, Sega's Genesis ran the slogan "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," positioning itself as the grown-up alternative to Nintendo. So Sega's success forced Nintendo to try spicing up its ads by the mid-90s. For instance, adopting a briefly grunge-friendly style to market Street Fighter 2 and Super Metroid, and later going for shock value with an M-rated game like Conker's Bad Fur Day. And I remember, it's so crazy because I remember Conker's Bad Fur Day. To me, it had the same allure as South Park. You know, funny little squirrel. I think Conker was a squirrel with a bazooka. But still edgy and somehow dirty. And one writer noted that by the late 90s, Nintendo went from wholesome, sweet, dad's my hero, to an angstly teenager image over the course of a few years. Still, the efforts were a bit half-hearted and even tongue-in-cheek, because Nintendo could never fully shake the kiddie reputation, because their primary franchises, Mario, Pokemon, were colorful and for all ages. Sony, by contrast, built its PlayStation identity from scratch in the mid-90s, specifically to rebel the kiddie image. That was a very conscious marketing decision. Sony's advertising agency in the US, Chiat Day, and marketeers like Lee Clow understood that the first generation of Nintendo and Sega kids were teenagers now, and they wanted something different. So Sony's campaigns for the PlayStation were famously surreal, bold, and edgy. They ran ads that at times didn't even show gameplay. Instead, they sold a feeling. One notorious UK commercial, Mental Wealth, in 1999, featured a weird alien-esque woman monologuing about the human mind. Very artsy and bizarre. In the US, early PlayStation print ads and billboards featured in-your-face slogans. And as we saw, they weren't afraid of a bit of S&M themed humor, with Sophia from Toshiden. For instance, there was a 1995 print ad for PlayStation. And in it, Sophia, the whip-wielding fighter in a leather corset, stands dominantly atop a PlayStation console. And the ad copy mimics the children's game Simon Says, except it's Sophia Says, and it goes, Sophia says, spend your money to reserve a Sony PlayStation. Sophia says, give money to your local video game store. Sophia says, get on your knees and bark like a dog. Now give Sophia a kiss. And then at the bottom in fine print, it's snarkily added, she didn't say Sophia says. Now she has to hurt you. I mean, that was for teenagers. Imagine an unsuspecting parent flipping through their kid's Game Pro and seeing that. It was cheeky, it was quasi-sexual and violent, and it hammered home that PlayStation was not positioning itself as a toy for little Johnny. Well, little Johnny maybe was enticed. Remember when all the old cartoons had like these double entendres that you would either get as an adult or would just go over your head when you were a kid? They probably did that, so it was appealing for both audiences without alienating one of them. If kids didn't get it, they didn't get it. But if they did, they did. So that strategy aligned perfectly with the $50 million marketing blitz Sony launched. Their goal was to lure an older audience, 20 and 30-somethings who grew up with video games, and get them back into playing, trying to use mature themes and attitude. So the strategy was clear. Make PlayStation the cool, subversive brand that teens want, even if their parents might be uneasy. And it worked. By Christmas 1995, Sony was selling PlayStation as fast as they could ship them. And they indeed pulled in a broad audience, from kids to adults. The bad kid vibe around PlayStation was really a side effect of brilliant marketing. Sony made their console seem like the forbidden fruit, the cutting-edge gadget your parents might raise an eyebrow at, which of course made kids want it even more. Nintendo, on the other hand, remained perhaps more wholesome choice. Which is crazy if you think about the history of those two companies, because Nintendo is an ancient company by tech standards. It was founded in 1889 in Japan, and they made gambling cards. Hanafuda playing cards, which were often used by gangsters and gamblers, like the Yakuza crime syndicates in the early 20th century. And there even was a rumor that Nintendo had a chain of love hotels, essentially a pay-by-the-hour adult hotel, which is not as wholesome. But again, just a rumor, allegedly. Please, Mr. Miyamoto, please. Forgive me for spreading those lies. But still, it was a paradox. The company that would later be seen as the guardian of child-friendly entertainment had its origin in gambling cards and maybe love hotels. And Sony, on the other hand, was founded in 1946, right after World War II, by engineers Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita. Sony was an electronics firm from day one. making Japan's first tape recorders and transistor radios, Trinitron TVs, and the Walkman. Sony's brand was about tech innovation and sleek consumer gadgets, not toys or games. By the 90s, Sony was a global conglomerate in music and movies as well as electronics. So the company with Vice in its DNA, Nintendo, ended up selling wholesome fun, while the straight-laced electronics giant Sony became the champion of edgy youth entertainment. Each leveraged their legacy in different ways when marketing their consoles. But with all these discoveries, like violent content on both consoles, differences in playstyles, the role of parents, peer influence, and marketing, this seems not to be a straightforward answer to our initial question. It seems that there are a lot of different factors at play, determining whether really there was a stereotypical player for one of the consoles. It's true that PlayStation en masse did have more violent games than Nintendo, and maybe Latchkey Kids had easier access to those, but that most likely is a stereotype, propelled by moms who didn't approve of other moms going to work. But yes, older kids influenced younger kids, and Sony's marketing deliberately cultivated an edgy image. That's true. So maybe all these factors created an environment where those latchkey kids would have been drawn to the PlayStation. But then there's my best friend, who was both a PlayStation 1 player and a latchkey kid. And he's one of the most gentle, soft-spoken, and simply nice people on earth, both as an adult as well as a kid. And I know the guy since we were 3 years old. He would have never hurt anyone or be mean. So we have to ask ourselves, can any of this mean that owning a PlayStation actually made a child bad or more violent, or that a bad or more violent kid wanted a PlayStation? Are we dealing with a real cause and effect, or is it a stereotype or correlation without explanation? Well, I guess we have to move away from anecdotal evidence and see what science had to say about games and youth behavior. Because for decades, psychologists and researchers have studied the link between violent media, including video games, and real-life aggression in youth. The consensus from scientific research over decades is clear. There is no direct correlation between playing video games and becoming a violent person. Youth violence actually declined in the 1990s and 2000s, even as violent video game sales skyrocketed. According to the US federal crime statistics, the rate of juvenile violent crime in the early 2000s was at a 30-year low, despite the widespread popularity of games like Doom, GTA, and yes, the PlayStation hits. If games were turning kids en masse into violent offenders, we'd expect the opposite trend. In reality, the overwhelming majority of kids who play do not commit antisocial acts. So the most research ever found was a weak correlation between violent gameplay and aggressive feelings. And importantly, correlation is not causation. And there was even a comprehensive review that noted that many studies claiming links have been inconclusive or were flawed methodologically. Laboratory studies found a tiny uptick in aggressive thoughts immediately after playing a video game, but it didn't translate to long-term criminal behavior or personality changes. And today we know that's just called rage quitting. And you know how many times I rage quit Mario Kart? And in 2019, a rigorous study by Oxford University found no relationship between the amount of violent gameplay and adolescent aggression levels. This study was one of the most definitive to date, using reports from both teens and their parents and pre-registering the analysis to avoid cherry-picking. The lead researchers stated plainly, the idea that violent video games drive real-world aggression is a popular one, but it hasn't tested very well over time. The research has not demonstrated there is cause for concern. Whenever you look back into the 90s, it's heartwarming what tiny problems we had back then. In short, playing video games did not predict which teenagers were more aggressive in real life. So when we think back at our initial question, it appears that the stereotype was driven by appearances and assumptions and not reality. Yes, PlayStation kids might have seemed more unruly or been exposed to more mature content, but research and countless real-life examples has shown that exposure does not equal outcome. A kid's behavior is shaped by many things: parenting, personality, friends, school, but the console they played is not a reliable indicator for them being good or bad. The division of Nintendo equals good and PlayStation equals bad was a social construct, a mix of marketing-fueled perceptions and selective examples, rather than a rule of childhood behavior. In the end, one's moral character cannot be determined by whether they stomped Goombas with Mario or decapitated foes in Mortal Kombat. Many of us who grew up in the 90s can now laugh at how parents fretted that our games would turn us violent, even as we became well-adjusted adults. Ironically, during the same era that adults were busy blaming consoles or music for youth behavior, we kids were learning social skills from playing together, bonding over shared games, learning problem-solving skills, creativity, you name it. This whole investigation highlights a timeless takeaway. We shouldn't judge or stereotype people based on surface traits, be it the clothes they wear, the music they listen to, or the game system they prefer. These things can become tribal identifiers, like the mini console war we examined. But they don't truly define a person's character. No plastic box of circuits can determine whether a kid grows up kind or cruel. And those latchkey kids with their house key around their necks, they weren't bad kids. If anything, those keys were a reminder that they were trusted to fend for themselves for a couple of hours before their parents returned home. It was one of those social cultural things where people had to start doing things differently and other people didn't like it. But what we can definitely say is that those latchkey kids found joy in companionship in the interim, either alone or with their friends. So I guess as an answer, we can just drop those labels and simply appreciate the 90s console rivalry for what it was. Not a battle between good and evil, but a colorful chapter of shared childhood memories, edgy ads, playground debates, and a reminder that games are enjoyed best without judgment. So yeah, this video was a little bit different. Let me know what you think, at least the 3 people who regularly watch the channel. And if you liked the video, you can watch a couple of more. Here, they all will be a little bit different, just as every game and every child is different in a beautiful way. See you next time.